Hello and welcome to today's class. We are going to continue in this theme for this week, you can say, where I'm trying to look at works of scholars, sociologists and others who are working from outside the center, outside Western Europe and outside United States. And in that same spirit, we are going to be looking at the work of Amita Bhaviskar, who is a sociologist and one can say an environmental historian. She has done work on the Narmada River and her more recent work, well, that is also now spanning a few decades, works is on Delhi and the urban ecology of Delhi. So the other frame that I'm going to introduce today is that of nature. This might seem kind of counterintuitive to an understanding or to a course on social theory, like where does nature fit in? But as you would see in today's class, how social relations and nature comes together in the various contexts that we are going to be looking at. This particular framework is largely referred to as urban political ecology. It's also sometimes referred to as urban ecology. Urban ecology developed somewhat earlier. So in the 1920s, it has its roots in the Chicago School of Urbanism, especially the work that I've put up here, Ernest Bourget, but several others who looked at the city from the ground. Like, so they would do field work, there would be ethnographic surveys, there would be combination of quantitative and qualitative techniques, and they used the language of biology. So succession, for example, like where one species takes over the others. Languages like that were used in order to explain the space of the city, in this case Chicago. And in this particular diagram, this particular model of urban growth, Bourget is trying to explain to us how newer immigrants first settle in the inner city areas, and then slowly, as either intergenerationally or there is social mobility within the same generation, they move somewhat to the outer rungs of this concentric circle. So it's called the concentric circle model of urban growth, and where the inner city areas are the industrial areas largely inhabited by more recent immigrants, but then this keeps shifting. So the succession keeps happening, right? So I'm just briefly alluding to this to set a background of what was seen as urban ecology. Much of that has changed when we use the term urban political ecology, because then also a Marxist framework comes up where we try to see how nature or the creations of this earth are used as resources and exploited within the capitalist process. So in urban political ecology, we bring together an understanding of social nature, which is basically social relations in relationship also with the so-called natural processes of this earth. One of the key works in this area is that of William Cronon and his essay, The Trouble with the Wilderness, coming out of the book Uncommon Wisdoms, Uncommon Ground, Rethinking the Human Place in Nature, asks us to rethink the idea of wilderness itself. He argues that the notion of wilderness is a constructed idea. It's something that is cultural, and he gives examples like, what would you consider more wild, like a dilapidated, overgrown parking lot or a managed national park which we go to see wilderness in, right? So how cultural ideas of wilderness have been shaped over the years is what he shows in this particular essay. I want to read out a small bit from his work. He writes, "This then is the central paradox. Wilderness embodies a dualistic vision in which the human is entirely outside the natural. If we allow ourselves to believe that nature, to be true, must also be wild, then our very presence in nature represents its fall. The place where we are is the place where nature is not. If this is so, if by definition wilderness leaves no place for human beings, save perhaps as contemplative sojourners, enjoying their leisurely reverie in God's natural cathedral, then also by definition it can offer no solution to the environmental and other problems that confront us. To the extent that we celebrate wilderness as the measure with which we judge civilization, we reproduce the dualism that sets humanity and nature at opposite poles. We thereby leave ourselves little hope of discovering what an ethical, sustainable, honorable human place in nature might actually look like. So he's basically talking about this division between society and nature, between the social and natural, right? Between wilderness and civilized. And he's saying this is a mythical or a culturally constructed dualism, and the fact that this dualism exists is a paradox, because then we are constantly seeing ourselves as outside the natural world. He further writes, before agriculture was midwifed in the Middle East, humans were in the wilderness. We had no concept of wilderness because everything was wilderness and we were a part of it. But with irrigation ditches, crop surpluses and permanent villages, we became apart from the natural world. Between the wilderness that created us and the civilization created by us grew an ever-widening rift. So much of Cronon's work has in fact been in investigating this rift, but also how to read nature, society, culture, politics together. One of his major works on Chicago, called The Nature's Metropolis, talks about how Chicago as a city grew as a result of the agrarian revolution, in a way, in its hinterland. Now I wish to come to the work of Amita Bhaviskar. We'll look at three aspects of how she understands the socio-nature or the social-natural, social-natural domain in Delhi by looking at, she uses several different sites, but I've picked three out of her book, Uncivil City, and these are the park, the river and the ridge. So let's start with the story of the park. And once again, I will read out the beginning of this particular essay because she so evocatively describes a particular happening in a public park in Delhi, and then goes on to bring to us the spatial segregation that constitutes the urban scape of Delhi. So let me read. She writes, Delhi on the morning of 30th January 1995 was waking up to another winter day. In the well-to-do colony of Ashok Vihar, early risers were settling off on morning walks, some accompanied by their pet dogs. As one of these residents walked into the neighborhood park, the only open area in the locality, he saw a young man, poorly clad, walking away with an empty bottle in hand. Incensed, he caught the man, called his neighbors and the police. A group of enraged house owners and 2 police constables descended on the youth and within minutes beat him to death. The young man was 18-year-old Dilip, a visitor to Delhi, who had come to watch the Republic Day parade in the capital. He was staying with his uncle in a jhuggi along the railway tracks bordering Ashok Vihar. His uncle worked as a labourer in an industrial estate nearby, which, like all other planned industrial zones in Delhi, had no provisions for workers' housing. The jhuggi cluster, with more than 10,000 households, shared 3 public toilets, each one with 8 latrines, effectively 1 toilet per 2,083 persons. For most residents then, any large open space under the cover of dark became a place to shit. Their use of the park brought them up against the more affluent residents of the area, who paid to have a wall constructed between the dirty, unsightly jhuggis and their own homes. The wall was soon breached, as much to allow the traffic of domestic workers who lived in the jhuggis but worked to clean the homes and cars of the rich, wash their clothes and mind their children, as to allow the delinquent defecators. Dilip's death was thus the culmination of a long-standing battle. over contested space that to one set of residents embodied their sense of gracious urban living, a place of trees and grass devoted to leisure and recreation, and which to another set of residents was the only available space that could be used as a toilet. If he had known this history of simmering conflict, Dilip would probably have been more wary and run away when challenged. Perhaps he would still be alive. This incident goes to the heart of a major environmental conflict that has remained relatively unexamined in the Indian context. So basically what she is trying to show us through this story is how that one piece of land that one set of residents call their park, which is used for leisure and leisurely stroll and recreation, and for the other set it needs to be used for an essential biological function like shitting. And these two uses of the same urban space, the same urban nature, are in conflict with each other. The aesthetics don't match, the meanings assigned to that open space don't match, the purpose doesn't match, and that leads to inherent conflict. And this conflict is unequally structured because one set of people are much higher in terms of their social capital than the other set of people. Moreover, in the same essay, she goes on to show how in Delhi, and she speaks about her growing up also, how those that are resident in the middle classes or upper classes are unaware of the living conditions of those living in the slums or shanty clusters and the needs of that particular segment of population. Now, these two very differential ways of living are not very different from the apartheid that we spoke about when we were speaking in one of the lectures about South Africa. And Bhaviskar calls this an apartheid of imagination. It's an apartheid of imagination because especially the people in the property owners of those who are living in single family homes, apartment complexes or planned part of the city do not have an imagination of what life is like in the slum areas of Delhi, right? So it's an apartheid of imagination. Now, in this whole struggle on this piece of land, and this is but one example of such a narrative, and there are multiple others of where parks are closed off to other residents, where there are controlled uses of the park, and who gets to have a say? It's usually what she calls the bourgeoisie, because they have the social capital, they have the literary skills in order to reach and articulate their version of environmentalism. And this version of environmentalism, Bhaviskar calls bourgeois environmentalism. For bourgeois environmentalism, Bhaviskar writes, urban nature is reimagined as ordered, enclosed and regulated. So parks, gardens and sanitized green spaces are those urban natures which need to be monitored, regulated and controlled. The desire for clean and green cities often translates into the removal of those seen as polluting, and then she narrates the whole history of slum demolitions, relocations and displacement because of a particular urban aesthetic that the bourgeois are trying to create for the city. So the removal of those seen as polluting, mainly slum dwellers, street vendors and animals. Environmental in the city becomes less about ecology and more about aesthetics, about how the city should look. So basically what she's trying to tell us is that who defines what environmentalism is, who defines what are the meanings one assigns to the environment, or how one engages with the urban nature or with the environment is dictated or defined by the bourgeoisie in the city. Middle class activism claims to speak for the public good. So there's the same dichotomy that we speak about when we speak about the global south. There is a universalism and there is a particularism. There is the idea of the general good, of the public good, but that idea of the public good conceals that it is basically the idea of the urban upper to middle classes. So this middle class activism about the environment claims to speak for the public good even as it marginalizes the urban poor. So a large part of Bhaviskar's work has been about ecology but also about equity. That's also what urban political ecology tries to do, is not just look at ecological concerns as if shielded from the social world, but also try to bring together questions of ecology along with questions of equity. So bourgeois environmentalism is not simply about protecting nature. It is about protecting a particular kind of city, a particular kind of aesthetics of the city, a particular kind of order in the city, and therefore a particular kind of citizen. So in that sense, bourgeois environmentalism is an exclusionary process. And how does this process unfold? She traces state-centered plans, master plans, regulations, norms that have a particular view, that only are able to see the city in one particular way and not from the perspective of the urban, marginalized or the informal sector slum dwellers. She writes, quoting James Scott from Seeing Like the State, that the facts of social life are not simply out there waiting to be discovered. They are structured by the state's need to making them legible. A plan, or orderly space, a manicured garden, what does it do? It creates a sense of safety, because it creates a sense of legibility. Designed or planned social order is necessarily schematic, right? Because it's what is on paper, and you imagine that somehow it will directly translate to that on the ground, which usually never happens. It always ignores the essential features of any real functioning social order. So this disjuncture between that which is planned and that which is lived gets highlighted when we start to look at the real lives of those that inhabit Delhi versus the Delhi master plan that has over the past decades come up with several policies for, she quotes those related to pollution. With the shifting of industrial units out of Delhi, you end up having to move a large percentage, almost 1/4 of Delhi's population that works or relies on these industries outside Delhi. So a lot of relocation, dislocation and breaking down of slums, and largely because of one particular vision of environmentalism, that is the bourgeois environmentalism. As Foucault reminds us, wherever there is control, there is resistance. What is stated or what is planned or what is legal is not necessarily what happens on the ground. So there is political patronage, there is the hafta system, there are all kinds of other associational engagements that enable, let's say, a settlement that has been given the order to be demolished or resettled to still continue to stay there, right? So these halfway places which are on paper not supposed to exist but then have managed to still continue to stay, Bhaviskar calls them jurisdictional twilight zones, and they also exist in the city and also are important aspects of the city's functioning, contributing to, as she pointed out, household labor, the cleaning of the city and so on. Now in this attempt to create the world-class city, she talks about the Asiad Games and then the Commonwealth Games. The city was cleaned of its so-called polluting elements. So a lot of squatters were moved, a lot of people were displaced, their houses were bulldozed, and the city was literally whitewashed. So in order to illustrate that, I've put up an art installation image from the artist Jitesh Malik, who documented the several layers that constitute Connaught Place in his work titled Whitewashed, by taking plaster of Paris POP casts of the columns in Connaught Place just before it was literally whitewashed. Many artists have engaged with these themes of urban transformation and how nature sits in uncomfortably or comfortably within the urban domain. Another artist's works that I want to bring up is Sheba Chachi and her art installations and photographs on the river Yamuna, juxtaposing the various uses of the river Yamuna, which Amita Bhaviskar also writes about, with an image of the polluted river banks as the backdrop, is part of this particular installation. So Amita Bhaviskar, in talking about urban political ecology of the river, reminds us that for the most part, the Yamuna river flew in as part of contemporary Delhi, kind of unnoticed, because it was largely the laborers or the migrant populations that would settle in the riverbeds, and it was mostly hidden from view for the rest of the residents of Delhi. Until 2010, when 4-lane highway was built on the west bank of the river, and there from the elevated aspects of the road one could view the river. Now this happened around the same time when in 2010 the river flooded. Another important timeline that she mentions is that in 2009 the Supreme Court had kind of opened up the riverbed or the watershed for urban speculation or as real estate, arguing that this is not the river bed. Very soon in 2010, the river itself challenged that view by flooding and reminded the residents of its existence. So this is the kind of dialectic or the engagement that continues to happen between nature and the city. And the city is usually seen as that civilized place which has moved away from nature, and yet nature continues to remind us that it exists. Since the highway had been built and offered an elevated view of the river, it became the site for a whole lot of media showing the flooding of the river, or the river breaching its flood marks, precarity of the bridges on it, and so on. So in this chapter, in this particular essay, Bhaviskar is trying to speak to us through this dynamic of the river, of the people who inhabit it, of the birds from Siberia that come to rest on it, of the open defecation that happens, and then therefore the riverbed appears like a wasteland, and then how many of these and the dhobis that wash on it, or the religious rituals that surround it. So these multiple uses are done away with once the river land is parceled off as real estate and sold off as either private property or a public institution, like she cites the Akshardham temple and the 2010 Commonwealth Games village are allowed to be constructed on what is a fragile, precarious ecosystem of the riverbed. These are the kind of questions one needs to look at when one is looking at the intersection of nature and society, or looking at socio-nature together. In the end, I will briefly allude to one more of her chapters that discusses her work on the Delhi Ridge, which is a part of the Aravalli Mountains, and it exists in several different parts. It's not entirely continuous. So there's the northern ridge, the central ridge, the south central ridge, and the southern ridge. And this is the slightly elevated forested part of the city. This was inhabited also by villagers at some point and was seen as the village commons for the most part, used by the landless lower caste populations in order to do their small little bit of farming, but largely understood as the village commons. Then it was around the 1980s and 90s, this village commons was converted into private property for those already owning private property. So it was divided in the proportion of land ownership amongst the village propertied classes, and therefore the whole shape of the ridge changes with this particular happening. So Bhaviskar documents the transformations and the ridge as a part of, as a spine in some ways that runs through the city of Delhi. I will close today's lecture with this reading from Raymond Williams that she starts off this essay with, and Williams writes, "We have mixed our labor with the earth, our forces with its forces, too deeply to be able to separate each other out." So basically he is reminding us how nature, the idea of nature, is a cultural construct. It's a product of our labor. But he also alerts us to the fact, and he writes, "If we say only that we have mixed our labor with the earth, our forces with its forces, we are stopping short of the truth that we have done this unequally. So it's important to look at both ecology and equity within the urban and outside the urban together, and that is what the domain of urban political ecology aims to do. So with that, I end today's lecture. See you in my next lecture. Bye.